surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.
I've always loved the Psalms because no matter what mood you're in or what stage of life, there always seems to be something that expresses those feelings you have deep down. You know what it's like when you find wonderful poetry and you read it and you think, that's exactly what I was feeling, but I didn't quite know how to get it out or to express it for myself. And the Psalms are like that. And it's risky today going to Psalm 23 because, as we've already heard, many of us were brought up on this psalm. We've sung it, we love it, and it's like when you have a favourite song and it means a particular thing to you, and then you read an article analysing the song and you think, what? Is that what they really meant? That can't be right. And it kind of wrecks it for you. So I hope that looking at Psalm 23 today doesn't wreck it for you. But I've recently come at it through and realised I'd never actually led a reflection or preached on it in my life, even though it's been part, particularly for many of us, associated with funeral services, and rightly so, for those wonderful words of God's presence with us at all times, where we shall not fear. But there are really in this psalm two ways of describing God's relationship with us. And the first is as shepherd, and then at the end, verses 5 and 6, it switches to God being like a host, if you like. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. I'm going to focus today on that first one, God as shepherd. Looking at God as shepherd then and now, but then actually, and there's good reason for doing this because it happens in the life of Israel, us as shepherds then and now. What does it mean for God to be a shepherd? Depends on your image of what sheep are like. I'm a city boy and I've never lived in the country. I've visited farms occasionally, and so I realised when I started thinking about this psalm, the picture it had for me was some lovely green pasture, and there's a quiet stream flowing through, and it's just idyllic and beautiful, isn't it? Well, shepherding really is nothing like that, because shepherds, if we go back to originally to the time when this psalm would have emerged, the land of Israel is rocky and rough. It's hilly. And there are some places where there is green pasture, but there's a lot of it that's not. It's rocky and barren. And a shepherd would know their sheep individually. It wouldn't be the flocks like we have here of thousands of sheep, but rather a small number. The shepherd would know them by name, and it would be the shepherd's responsibility to make sure that those sheep flourished, that they thrived, that they were taken to places where there was green grass, where there was water. For on their own, they wouldn't be able to get to it. When I observed sheep up close and personal once, it was a bit scary. I was staying on a holiday farm in Victoria, and this little cottage was in the middle of these fields, and there were a smaller number of sheep, a few hundred, who had the freedom of the paddock, and they would wander around. And I remember them coming up close to the house and realising that they were a bit bigger than I thought, and that they didn't look overly friendly. Some of them looked a bit cantankerous, to be honest. But I observed them closely, and from the safety of behind the glass, with the fire going, much better way to observe sheep, and they would appear to be in a clump, just chewing their grass as sheep do. And they'd all be there with their heads down, and then all of a sudden, And I don't know if there was some inner language being spoken, like in Babe, where they communicate to each other. All of a sudden, one of the sheep would just head off down a different direction. And by some mysterious way, the others would suddenly look up and, oh, that's a good idea, we'll follow along. And they would all go off where that sheep went. I'm not sure what that was about, but there was some sense that I had that there was direction being given. And in the psalm, it's the idea that without some sort of direction, whether, in my case, I observed it looked like the sheep were directing themselves, but very clearly the farmer would have to, even in our context, provide the right pasture for the sheep and take them to where they had to be. They have to shear them, crutch them, do all those things that are needed for the sheep to flourish. And here's the analogy, right? That we as people need God in our life to enable us to flourish. Now back then, if we go back to David's time, 1,000 years before Jesus, David, we know, was a shepherd. And so this shepherd's psalm has become a beautiful, rich association. We reflect on David being out in that rocky ground with a small number of sheep, and even with his rod and staff having to force away wild animals that might come to prey on the sheep, and then having to use the rod and staff to kind of give the sheep a little whack, the way a sheepdog does today, to give them a little bit of guidance so that they go where they're meant to go, so that they get the good pasture. And there's a picture there of the way God does that. David knew it for himself personally in his own life. He'd come to become king, and yet that hadn't been an easy task. He'd had this sense of anointing, and yet his life was under threat numerous times. And even after he became king, when things went wrong in his life, he had to flee his home and work out whether God was still with him or not. So it was a very real expression for him. But not only for him, but think about these psalms. They were the hymns of Israel. And so when the people of Israel sang Psalm 23 or chanted it at the synagogue, it was meaning for them, we see God as the one who guides and leads. All those things that the shepherd does for those sheep are ways that God is the one who looks after us as God's people. The nation recognised that they needed God, and there's a reference back here to the Exodus even, when God leads the people out of Egypt, where they're slaves, and they wander through the desert, and literally they are having to be guided to where there's food and water. And there's a pillar of cloud by day. God provides food miraculously at different times. Without that, they would have perished. And so Israel, as they sing this psalm, are not only thinking, isn't it lovely God is with us, but they're saying our very existence as the people of Israel is due to God's leading, God's guiding, and God leading us to life. Now, when we come to the psalm and think of God as shepherd, we do it, as it were, through the eyes of Jesus, looking back from our vantage point. Now, besides it being a nice thought, in what ways does God act as our shepherd? How does God bring us life? Because one of the dangers of beautiful psalms and thoughts is that we can think, yes, it's lovely, isn't it? The Lord is our shepherd. But what does that really mean? In the sense of in our relationship with God, firstly, for ourselves. Well, it might mean many things. I just want to touch on 3 ideas. The first is that our relationship with God and God being our shepherd and caring for us, it brings us a sense of peace because we have forgiveness. Green pastures, lying down, feeling safe. Within ourselves, in our life, we can live out of that place of peace and safety and comfort by knowing that we're forgiven. The second thing is that we can know that we're worthy. And people talk a bit today about whether Western society has become more of a shame-based culture rather than a guilt and sin type based culture. There was a time probably when encouraging people that God would forgive you meant something more, because many people carried perhaps a sense of guilt, or of that word sin that we use was perhaps part of everyday thinking. It's possible that now the idea of being unworthy is a stronger drive within people. Certainly in social media and discourse around now, isn't it? You see a lot this idea of people being shamed, or of being unworthy, or of not living well enough somehow. Now, what does the psalm say to people like us in that kind of inner predicament? We go back to Genesis 3, interestingly enough, and Adam and Eve, the story where they eat the fruit. And what happens? They feel ashamed. They realise that they're naked. It's like a picture of being stripped bare, of being embarrassed, and of being unworthy to be in God's presence. And that story there in Genesis is describing something of the human predicament, that in some way we often feel exposed to others, to God, and we feel unworthy. And in our modern world, we're driven to feel that more and more, because advertising depends on us feeling inadequate. It says, if you buy this, or if you have this experience, or if you have this relationship, then you'll be satisfied, and then you might feel good enough, then you'll be worthy. But it doesn't always work, does it? Because there's always the next thing. Or are we ever good enough? Do we live up to our own standards? Or is our life successful enough that we can post it on Facebook or Instagram? But Jesus shows us that we're loved. Simple words, but loved always, and known. And to be known as you really are and still considered worthy. That slowly works its way through our psyches so that we don't need to feel ashamed or embarrassed. We're clothed in the eyes of God. And that third aspect of how we come to greener pastures through knowing God as our shepherd, really does tie in with that idea of we walk through the darkest valley, or the shadow of death. We will fear no evil, for you are with me. Now, it does, of course, speak wonderfully to the idea of, in some way, the life beyond. That reality of death that we don't like to speak of in our world, do we? That reality that we only confront when we have to, and yet it's there for every one of us, sometime. That can be a scary thought. Now, we don't know what it's going to be like, and yet we have a picture here and then through Jesus embracing death and being raised to life, that even in that time, God is with us. That image too speaks of life now, not just about the shadow of death, but rather it's a picture of a dark valley. Maybe, if you picture tall cliffs and they're cast in shadow and you don't know whether there's anyone lurking behind the rocks, and you're walking your way through and it's like, oh, this is a bit scary. Or think of in our city, a dark alley at night. And you're walking through and somehow the street lights have gone out and you're walking down a dark lane and your mind starts playing tricks. Is someone going to jump out? Now, life can be like that, a walking through times of darkness and fear. And it's the picture here of God being with us, God's Spirit always with us, even through those moments. And these are hard-fought lessons for David as he writes the psalm. They're not just trite, throwaway greeting card lines. They're hard-fought and held on to through experience and through holding on to what he knows. So God is our shepherd. But then there's something here for the way that we are shepherds. because God's shepherding is experienced by us through the community, through each other. Someone said to me the other day, it's a bit like Christ working through us. So we know God, we could say vertically, in that inner sense, our spirit and God's spirit, but very often we experience who God is through each other. And so in what way are we shepherds to each other? It's always been like that, and Israel recognised it. They talk often about their kings and their leaders, their priests are referred to as shepherds. And sometimes the shepherds didn't do it well. And so in Ezekiel 34, there is a strong sense in which God says, the shepherds of my people, they're leading people astray. And why? Because they're so caught up with their own needs and their own agenda and their need for power that they've forgotten that they're there for others. What a surprise that people with power end up abusing it. What a surprise that people who have responsibility for others don't always exercise that responsibility well. But it's not just those with official responsibility, for there's a way in which all of us are shepherds to each other, whether you have an official leadership position, whether you're a minister or a pastor or a church council member or an elder, or whether you're a leader of a group. But even anyone in a relationship with another person has in some way an influence, a power that comes through being in that relationship. So how do we do that? Well, fortunately we have the picture of Jesus as a shepherd. John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. And what does the good shepherd do? Lays down his life for the sheep. And so whatever shepherding relationship there is lived through that lens of laying down your life for the other. Not for your own agenda, your own needs, but for the other. And the key in that is this very surprising twist. Because Jesus is both shepherd and sheep. God comes as one of us. And so this image of the Lord is my shepherd, we could start seeing the shepherd as being separate from the sheep. And that's the natural rendering of it, right? But if you start to tease out the idea that Jesus comes, God's presence lived out among us, there's a surprising way in which Jesus is both shepherd and sheep, and that tells us that any of us who are officially in shepherding type roles exercise that by being one of those that they shepherd. This has been a revolutionary thought for me and powerful as I've come into this position where I'm in now, where I coordinate chaplaincy. For one of the essences of being a chaplain or a pastoral carer is that you live out your care relationship by walking alongside people, accompanying them. Yes, you bring who you are and what you have, but you do that in a humble stance of walking alongside with someone rather than seeing yourself as coming in over the top of. And there's something powerful here for our picture of how the church speaks into our world today. For one of the aspects of God that has been rejected by many people is the arrogance and pride of a church that has clearly gone wrong and yet been in the position of saying, we are the ones of virtue and we know the way. If we recapture the idea of speaking as shepherds of a culture with something to offer and to say, but doing that as sheep, if you like, from a position of humility. It's a very different way of looking at that role and that presence that we have in our world. The Lord is our shepherd, and we shepherd one another. Think of those aspects of forgiveness and being treated with worth and offering hope. That's the invitation that we have as God's people too. For when someone really gets to know you We might say knows the worst about you, although we might not often get to that, right? Because we can't cope. That's a bit too much for you to know the worst about me. But you might know some of my frailties. And if you know those and still love me, then that fleshes out the idea that God actually loves me. And if I stuff up and you forgive me, then that really deep down tells me that those words I know about God forgiving me, they're real because I experience them in the community. What a beautiful picture that is of God as our shepherd, and that God as shepherd being lived out as we shepherd each other.